there's two things that I'm really passionate about in terms of the giving back that I do. One is an organization called Anti-Up for Africa, which I founded with Don Cheadle, and what we do is raise money for the benefit of Darfur and South Sudan in terms of trying to stabilize that area of the world. That's sort of what I talk about as the sexy stuff that I do. It's very easy to sell to the public, which is obviously an issue that we have in terms of trying to fundraise and get our causes together. How do we get the public to be passionate about it? And that's a very easy one. The harder thing that I do is working on decision education. I'm on the board of something called the Decision Education Foundation, and what we do there is we try to develop curricula to teach our children, K through 12, both underprivileged and privileged children, critical thinking skills and good decision-making skills. This obviously is a little bit harder to sell to the public, but as far as what the state of education is in America, I think it's an extremely important cause. I'm extremely passionate about it, and I'm going to try to show you why this is such a cool thing and why we'd like to be teaching our kids this. So basically, the way that I got involved in it is that I have a background in cognitive science from UPenn. I was getting my PhD there. And I went on, obviously, to use my PhD very wisely and become a poker player. I've always said that I'm sure the National Science Foundation is very happy with the way that I used that fellowship. There you go. But basically, what I do for a living is I take advantage of people who are bad decision makers. Because poker is a game where you have to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, meaning you can't see the other person's hole cards, so you have to create these decision chains without actually knowing what they have. It's a very complex decision-making process, and sort of to give you an idea of how deep this decision-making process, I'm sure that many of you have heard of game theory. It was actually popularized somewhat in the movie A Beautiful Mind, which featured the story of John Nash. John Nash's mentor was a guy named John von Neumann, who worked at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton alongside Einstein. He was named the smartest man of the first half of the 20th century in 1950 by Time magazine. Again, Einstein was alive then, so this guy was really important. He developed this economic theory called game theory, and he based it on the game of poker. And asked why he didn't base it on the game of chess, he said, chess is just a calculation. Poker is a game. So we know that this whole, because game theory is really just about decision-making, and particularly long-term decision-making. We know that poker must be a good basis for understanding decision-making skills. So I'm going to show you how sexy decision-making can be today, hopefully. And I'm going to talk about what I call cooperative ultimatums, which of course is a little bit of an oxymoron because it doesn't feel like ultimatums should be cooperative, but I think poker can show you that they can be. So you guys are familiar with this, but children tend not to be familiar with this, and many adults in our country tend not to be familiar with this, but I'm just going to review this with you. This is essentially a decision chain, but essentially what it says is, helpful frame is what's the problem? And then we have our clear values, which means that we need to know when we're trying to solve a problem, what are our values in solving that problem? For example, are we Machiavellian? Do we believe that the ends justify the means? That's going to open up different alternatives than if you don't believe that the ends justify the means, as an example. So the values kind of determine what your creative alternatives are going to be. As you're figuring out what your alternatives are, then as you get to your alternatives, you have to go and look for the useful information that will allow you to evaluate those alternatives. You obviously have to follow through, and then you have to be reasoning soundly, which obviously is a little bit of a problem because the whole thing will fall apart if you haven't actually thought it through in a rational way. So that just has to do with rational thinking, which is another problem that poker can teach us about, but not one that I'm going to talk about today. Today, what I'm going to talk about is the creative alternatives piece of the puzzle, and poker can really teach us a lot about alternatives toward goals. And what we're going to talk about today is specifically the goal of you have a relationship with someone and you believe that they're not behaving in a way that you're happy about. And so you want to change their behavior in some way. And so this is now our goal. And what are the alternatives in terms of being able to accomplish that? And we're going to look at what poker can teach us about that. So we have different types of relationships. Obviously, we have the superior-inferior relationship, which would be parent-child, if you're the employer and you have an employee. And then we have peer-to-peer, coworker, spouse, partner, and friends. And in all of these, we get into situations where we'd like them to change their behavior in some way. Now, the question is, what does poker teach us about ultimatums? Well, we can think about ultimatums really as similar to bluffing in poker. So in bluffing, you're trying to get someone to behave in a way in terms of folding their hand. You want them to go away out of the hand. You don't want them to call you. And if we think about somebody behaving badly, when we deliver an ultimatum, it always means you do this or else. And clearly, we don't want the or else to happen. We want them to fold and change their behavior. We don't want them to call and say, oh yeah, then what's, or else, fine, right? So we know that if we think about bluffing in poker, that it should be able to tell us something about the way ultimatums should work in real life. So this is a bluff. You have a hand like King Jack. Here's the 5 cards. So you're trying to make the best 5-card hand out of these 7 cards. Clearly, you don't have anything. You don't have a pair. You started off with 4 clubs, but you don't hit another club. You have nothing. So the question is, how are you supposed to win this hand now that you absolutely have nothing? The only way you're ever going to win this hand is to bet and try to bluff. And what most people do, in fact, the vast majority of poker players do, is they bet really big. Because what they think is, if I bet really, really, really big, I will look really, really, really scary to my opponent, and that will make me fold. Now, the problem with that is that when you get called, you're out of the game. That's actually a really big problem. There's nowhere to go from there. There's a mathematical issue, too, which I won't get into the details of because we're just talking about the decision problem. But it turns out that what good poker players do is they bet the smallest amount that they think will accomplish their goals. Now, first of all, when you bet smaller rather than bigger, the actual market, what the money in the pot stays the same so that you'll make more money that way because it's a smaller investment in the outcome. But very importantly, it never takes you out of the game. It gives you somewhere to go when you fail, right? Because you still can play and you can just bet a little bigger the next time. And this is a really important one. It's often more believable. So if we take this now into real life, basically what you see is that when people generally deliver ultimatums, and I'm sure you can think about this from your own life, what they usually do is exactly what the majority of poker players do, which is they think, what is the biggest thing that matters to my opponent, if we're thinking about this as sort of an opponent situation. So, for example, and I see this from parents all the time, they say to their kid, like, for example, I have 4 children. So let's say I'm taking them on some hellish trip, like to Disneyland that day. And one of my children is misbehaving. This happens to me. What most parents will do in that situation is say to the child, if you don't behave, you're not going to Disneyland. And the problem with that is that it's a threat that you really can't follow through on, because you can't punish your other 3 children by not taking them to Disneyland because one of your children is misbehaving. I'm assuming you don't have childcare, so you can't leave your child behind alone. At least I hope you're not going to, in order to follow through. And if they continue to misbehave, you just have nowhere to go from there. You've already threatened kind of the biggest thing that you can possibly imagine with them. Employees do this with their employers. They go in and say, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to quit. And the problem is that if the employer says, no, I can't afford a raise right now, I guarantee you that the majority of people who deliver that threat actually don't quit. And the problem with that is that, again, you have nowhere to go from there. You've taken yourself out of the game. You haven't had a commitment to follow through. And now you've lost credibility going forward. This is a problem for parents. It's a problem for employers. It's a problem for employees. And it really is the exact same problem that people have in poker. Now, when we look at this piece, it's often more believable. This also translates into this sort of ultimatum situation where, look, when I say to my child, my kids are relatively intelligent, as most children are, and I say to my child, if you don't do this, I'm not going to take you to Disneyland, my child knows that that's ridiculous. That of course I'm going to take them to Disneyland. Like when you go into your employer and you say, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to quit, your employee knows pretty well, particularly in this economy, that you actually won't quit. And it's actually not believable. So if they think about what we do in poker, bet small, and then you have places to move from there. If we do want to happen to deliver an ultimatum to somebody, then we can do it in exactly the same way in real life, which is instead of thinking about what's the biggest thing that matters to this person and I'm going to threaten that, think instead on the opposite end of the scale. What's the smallest person? What's the smallest thing that matters to this person? And then go for that. So, for example, with a child, it might be if you don't behave, I'm going to put you in timeout for 5 minutes. That's actually a very effective thing to do because you're socially separating them. One thing that I do is if you don't behave, then I'm going to make you sit down and write an essay about what you're doing wrong. That's a wonderful one. And notice that it's something extremely easy to actually follow through on. So if you are going to sort of, anytime that you deliver an ultimatum, if you do want to set up an adversarial relationship, you can do it in this way. Start small, move up from there. When we think about relationships, instead of saying, like, if you don't put the cap on the toothpaste, I'm leaving you. I've actually heard that before, by the way, which is funny. Say, when you don't put the cap on the toothpaste, I want you to understand how that makes me feel because I've asked you to do it in the past, and now you're not doing it, and that makes me feel like you don't respect me. That's a very small thing to say to somebody, to allow them to know what the consequences of what they do, and then you have somewhere to go in the conversation, as opposed to them now not putting the cap on the toothpaste the next day, and you have being faced with, actually, if you want to follow through, leaving the person. So now, a huge bet is occasionally useful. And let me show you a situation. So I know this is a little pokery. Hopefully you'll bear with me. But what you can see here is your hand is 2 9s, and the board has given you 3 9s. So 3 9s is a really, really good hand. In fact, you're very sure that you have the best hand here. The problem is that the board is such that the possibilities for the next card can be greatly expanded. So let me explain what I mean. When we're talking about decision-making in poker, we're thinking about the set of possible hands that our opponent can have. And obviously, the smaller the set of possible hands our opponent can have, the better off we're going to be in our decisions because we're just dealing with fewer possibilities. The issue with this kind of board is that if another one of the clubs comes out, now we have all of the possibilities of flushes, and then there's also straights. So straights are 5 cards that are consecutive in rank. So for example, 8, 9, 10, Jack, Queen. So if our opponent had a hand like Queen Jack here, if a king hit, they'd make a straight, or if they had King Jack, if a queen hit. So there's lots and lots of cards that can come. In fact, it's fully over 50% of the deck that can come that will really drastically expand the possibilities for what our opponent can hold. And that, basically what that means is that we want to subvert the decision-making process at this point. We know right now we have the best hand. We know that the set of possibilities for what our opponent could have that could possibly beat us is very small at the moment. We know that it's going to drastically explode, like in an exponential way, on the next card, and so we'll just put all our money in right now, because if we put all our money on the table, then there are no further decisions to be made, because you can't bet anymore. So essentially, the one-liner on that is that it's okay to make big bets when you're happy if they go away, which you would be here, or you're happy if you they call, which you would be here as well, because you have the best hand. So basically, good players will try to only bet huge when they're happy with the result either way. So we can think about that in life too, which is you can make these huge bets in life when you're happy with the result either way. If we go back to the job situation, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to quit, that's totally fine if, for example, you have actually saved up enough money that you can now go off without a job and go and look for a job and find some other opportunities for yourself, or if you have another job offer lined up. Now you can go in and you can truthfully say to your boss, if you don't do this, I'll quit, because you can actually follow through with it. You're okay with the result either way. If you get the raise, you're happy. And if you don't, you have something else to go to, so you're happy then too. When we think about relationships, there's a very good example of when this is okay. Let's say that you have a partner who you've had a very good relationship in the past who has now, say, started using drugs or abusing alcohol. Obviously, the situation at that moment in time is completely untenable for you. So if you knew that the situation were going to continue as such, you would certainly leave, because that would be upside to you. But you also feel like if the situation were to change, that you would also be happy to stay with them. So you're happy either way, whichever way it goes, and you then can say to your spouse, if you don't go into rehab, I'm going to leave you, and then that's okay, because you're happy with the result either way. So when you're happy with the result either way, you can make these really, really, really big bets, big ultimatums. But an even better solution than starting off small and moving up from there, or betting big only in this sort of happy situation, is something that poker players do very often, which is to get the other person to bet for you. So in poker, a lot of times we have hands where we know that if we bet, there might not be a lot of hands that don't beat us that will call us. So that's kind of a weird situation because we're not sure how much to bet, we're not sure how much they'll call. If they do have a worse hand, we're worried about the result. If they do call, that they might have a better hand. So what we do instead is we pass the action to the other person and we allow them to determine their fate. And the reason why that's such a good play in poker is that they will bet a much wider range of hands than they'll actually call us with. So we get all of those hands that are worse than us to call us. So it's a tool that's actually one of the most frequently used tools by poker players, is to allow the other person to set the decision, to allow the other person to set the bar for themselves and sort of determine their own fate. This eliminates the problem of credibility because the other person is betting for you, so there's no credibility issue on your part. It certainly eliminates the problem of follow-through because you're causing the other person to do the betting, so you don't have to follow through on anything. And, as I said, the other player will often bet a wider range of hands than they would actually call with. Now, you can apply this, and this is actually probably the best tool in terms of these ultimatums, and this is where I get into this idea of cooperative ultimatums as opposed to sort of more opponent relationships, and why I think it's the best solution is to get the other person to set their own consequences. And what's really beautiful about getting the other person to set their own consequences is then there's nothing for you as an individual to follow through on. It's on the other person to follow through on the consequences that they've set for themselves. They'll often actually set consequences that are more severe than the consequences that you would have set, and now they own their own fate. And they're more likely as an individual to follow through because you've allowed them to become a partner with you in the process. So, for example, with my children, when they do something wrong, much to their annoyance, I always say to them, what do you think the consequence should be? And they always say, I don't know, tell me. And I say, no, 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 no. I asked you what you think the consequence should be, and then they'll figure out a consequence that they think logically follows from whatever it is that I'm upset about. And they're actually very good at following through with those because they own it. You can do this as an employer with an employee. When an employee is falling down on the job, you say, what do you think that you're doing wrong? What do you think that the follow-through should be? How do you think you can improve? And what do you think the consequences should be if you don't follow through? So you basically, you're doing the exact same thing as if you were delivering an ultimatum to them, which creates an adversarial relationship, right? Anytime we deliver an ultimatum to someone, we're being their adversary. You're getting the exact same result because you're still creating an ultimatum situation. Essentially, it's still if you don't do this or else. But what you've done is you've created it in a cooperative way because you're allowing them to set their own ultimatum as your partner. So that's really one of the main things that we learn from poker is that if you can't get someone to cooperate with you, certainly start off betting small unless you're happy with the result either way, at which point you can do what you want because you can end the relationship. But really, in reality, getting the person to cooperate you is going to be the best choice. And this is the choice that poker players take almost all the time.